A very warm welcome to everybody for this, I think, 5th John Halstead Memorial Lecture. I'm Mike Mecham from the Society for the Study of Labour History, and I had the honour of chairing the first of these lectures back in 2022, and I'm so pleased to see Margaret Halstead and her family here again. I hope the trains were better this time, but really,
Taxi this time.
Taxi this time. There are, when I started looking at it, there are parallels, I think, between John Halstead and today's speaker, Professor John Goodridge. John Halstead was a foundational figure in the Society for over 60 years. And though I'm not going to say the same about John Goodridge, the same could be said about him in the sense that he's been at the heart of labouring class literature, becoming a leading figure, if I may say so, for nearly 40 years by my estimate, John.
Yeah.
Yep, good man. He's taught, researched, published, encouraged and nurtured, and that's very important, nurtured others over those years. His period as editorial director of Trent Publications was groundbreaking, as he brought to us forgotten, overlooked, and even unknown poets and writers who were brought out of the shadows and published widely. More recently, John has edited with his colleague Adam Bridgen, who's in the front row here, this magnificent book. It's called British Working Class and Radical Writing Since 1700. It is in paperback, it is in hardback, and John tells me it's on open access. So you can access it, anybody can access it, get onto it. And I certainly would encourage people to do that because it's a terrific book. But a particular passion of John's, there's lots of Johns this afternoon. There's John Halstead, John Goodridge, and now I'm going to mention John Clare, because a great passion of John is England's greatest working class poet, John Clare. And John is currently a very active, president, not always active, but a very active president of the John Clare Society. His 2013 study, John Clare and Community, remains a key work for all of us who have an interest in John Clare. And this is where there is another link, I think, with John Halstead. After I sent him a selection of John Clare's poems, we developed a conversation about poetry, and I've brought one of the letters along and given a copy of it to Margaret Halstead. But especially his enthusiasm for the Yorkshire poets Simon Armitage and the late great Tony Harrison. And that's the connection, because John will be including in his lectures reflections, once or another, on Tony Harrison. But a fuller note of John's immense contribution to labouring class literature can be found on the Society's website. But apart from those things I've already mentioned, he is Emeritus Professor of English at Nottingham Trent University. In 2017, he co-edited the Cambridge History of Working Class Writing with Richard Keegan, an American academic. And between, I had to change this after chatting to them before this session, between 2003 and 2006, I was going to say he was a co-editor, but he was the leading editor of 6 volumes of 18th and 19th century labouring class poetry. John is also very active online, and we will show you at the very beginning what he's done with a catalogue of labouring class poetry. And he also runs the History of British Working Class Literature Facebook page. So I thought you'd retired, John, but there you go. There's no sense of retirement there. John's subject today is really the struggles of labouring class poets, and he's prefaced it with the reading by Glowman, and I like that. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you all to give a warm welcome to our speaker today, Professor John Goodridge.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for those extremely kind words, and thank you everybody for coming. Can you hear me at the back? And if it gets too loud, go like that. If you can't hear, go like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my history with this, so I'm sorry to go on about myself, it won't last too long. 40 years ago, writing my PhD on 18th century rural poetry, I came across the poems of Stephen Duck and Mary Collier, who were then almost unknown Labour poets. I'll come back to that. I also joined the John Clare Society and soon realised that Clare, who was still an outsider then to the big six romantic poets, had a groundswell of enthusiasm in the community. I think he always did, and it was always an underground tradition. So I could see that such poets were valued beyond academia, beyond official literature, and I began to collect information about them. I became a stamp collector or a train spotter of labouring class poets. I felt they were neglected, or worse, treated as special cases, as freaks of nature, in the way that F.R. Leavis treats Wullabing Heights in a footnote to the great tradition, as an oddity that doesn't fit in. And I wanted to discover the extent of this neglected tradition. Well, 40 years on, the catalogue of labouring class poets, is well over 500,000 words, and has 2,400 author entries, mainly from 1700 to 1900. Thanks to scholars like Andrew Hobbs and Kirsty Blair, I realised a lot of these poems were not in dusty old books in the British Library, but in newspapers and periodicals. Anthologies like Brian Maidment's The Poorhouse Fugitives in 1987 were important pointers. And 40 years on, John Clare is one of the most researched and read figures of his entire century, speaking to our anxieties about the destruction of the natural world. He's a pioneering ecological figure, treating nature as an equal partner, which is very strange for his time. And I think his struggles and continuing to write in his long asylum years are also inspiring to many people. But as for the other 2,399 poets, there's still a lot of work to be done in discovery, analysis and interpretation. So I'm going to look at some of them today and try and give some perspective on their struggles and on their achievements too. The glowworms in my title alludes to one of them. John Gregory, okay, 1831 to 1922, a Devon-born Bristol poet, shoemaker, socialist, and a major figure in the birth of an independent working class movement in Bristol. Near the end of Gregory's long life, he got an honorary master's degree from Bristol University, but he'd spent most of that life in poverty. Now this is from the preface to his second collection, Song Streams, 1877. Courteous reader, by the dim glow of a few bottled glowworms, I once saw a countryman reading the Bible. This anecdote I pen that you may comprehend the extreme difficulty a toil drudge has to overcome ere he accomplishes the feat of launching into the flood of literature such a volume as this. I think this nicely addresses a serious issue. How hard it was for a worker to publish a volume of poems. And it would be difficult in all sorts of ways, including very basic ones. You had to attain literacy and learn literary skills. You need light, books, paper, pens, and time. These can all be taken for granted for a middle class or an upper class poet. The history of labouring class poetry is filled with instances of individuals battling for all these basics. The Wiltshire farm worker and poet Stephen Duck, 1705 to 56, borrowed books such as Edward Bish's Art of Poetry, a digest of useful quotes and snippets, and The Spectator, which was then a periodical that gave mainstream guidance on taste. 100 years later, John Clare, lacking paper, learned his geometry by drawing triangles with his finger in the dust of a barn wall, and begged tea and sugar wrappers from his mother. You can still find these blue and brown pages amongst his poetry manuscripts at Peterborough, including some where his homemade oak gall ink has burned right through the page, so it's like a sort of a doily. Or consider the brilliant coal miner poet from the northeast, Joseph Skipsey, 1832 to 1903, in the extreme darkness of a coal mine as a trapper boy, opening and closing ventilation doors as the coal trucks came through, who scrounged candle ends from the older miners and traced and wrote on old scraps of posters and bits of paper lying around in the mine. Some poets had no literacy skills and could not write even if they got the materials. Neither Sheffield's radical filesmith balladeer Joseph Mather nor the Scillonian poet Robert Mabie, who wrote about shipwrecks on the Scilly Isles, could write, but their compositions were valued in the community, so others wrote them down for them, and they got published. Edward Rushton, a Liverpool sailor poet and abolitionist, was unsighted, but like a number of other blind and disabled labouring class poets, found ways to express a radical vision and get into print. So resources of the most basic kind had to be actively sought. The countryman with his glowworms is an image of real need. The words in the King James Bible he knows he has to see, even at the cost of his eyesight. Then there's getting into print. By the time Gregory was writing in the late 19th century, there were options, most prominently newspapers, all hungry for copy, and he made full use of them to spread his name and poems around and develop a reputation. This in turn won local support to publish volumes, though at least two of his were self-published, including song streams. But if we go back earlier, say to the 18th century, the only way to get a volume into print would be through a system of patronage that invariably involved ideology. Because labouring class poets were always fetishised, were always treated as special cases. They were never just poets. Their class defined them through an evolving series of stereotypes. The peasant poet, the uneducated poet, the self-made man, the heroic proletariat. So the problems were not just practical. Writing, patronage, publication, reception were all dominated by specific ideas of what a labouring class poet is and should be. And we can trace this right back to the beginning, because the first English poet whose name we know was also the first labouring class poet whose name we know. And this is Cadmon, died in 680, a herdsman at Whitby Abbey, who later became a monk. His story is told, and his single extant poem, the alliterative hymn to the Creator, which apparently came to him in a vision, survives in a single source, Bede's ecclesiastical history, circa 1731. Cadman's story is headed, in the Penguin translation, "A brother of the monastery is found to possess God's gift of poetry," and he was noted for the skill with which he could compose religious and devotional songs when any passage of scripture was explained to him. So he was an oral poet who composed in his native English, though Bede writes in Latin, so we had to take that on trust from later back translations. And we had to take other things on trust too. Catherine Clarke begins A History of England in 25 Poems, 2025, with a chapter on Cadman's hymn, and questions the reverential way modern editors have treated it as a landmark moment in English history. So I noticed that, for example, Carol Ann Duffy and Gillian Clarke in The Map and the Clock and Laureate's Choice of the Poetry of Britain and Ireland begin with Cadman's hymn, translated by Paul Muldoon. But Catherine Clarke sees the poem as a brilliant sleight of hand by Bede, a beautiful and brilliant illusion, but an illusion nevertheless. This is a significant challenge to what she calls the carefully crafted myth. And it's important because the Cadman story, she says, underpins ideas of English identity through the Middle Ages and beyond. It's the first poetic statement of English Christian identity given in the first history of the nation. And she asks, why should it be put into the mouth of the most humble, lowly figure imaginable? And I would say that this sleight of hand is really about presentation. Whether Cadman existed or not, which we can't really answer, he represents the birth of an idea of the labouring class poet, here cast in a specific way as a carrier of meaning. He is noble and honest, a plain and unpretentious person, pious and patriotic in a simple way. His poetry miraculously dictated from above, and in short, a perfect symbol in the idealised view of the birth of a nation. It's the first sign in a long history that a labouring class poet must be presented in a particular and special way. We have to leap forward to pick up this story 1,000 years, because we know no other labouring class English poet in all those centuries. So Cadman, if he did exist, is a lone figure. He's like Rotsweitha, the abbess of Gambesheim, who wrote plays in the 10th century, despite the fact that no other individual is known to have written plays for hundreds of years before or after. Going back to poets, in the later medieval period there's Blind Harry in Scotland, 1440 to 92, and there is a general sense of a class division between the two great 14th century English poets, well-connected cosmopolitan Geoffrey Chaucer and modest West Midlands-based William Langland, who was possibly in small orders or was an unbeneficed clerk, the recognised way a man from a poor background lifted himself up in society. But so little is known about him, and so dubious is the process of gleaning biographical information from his great work, Piers Plowman, that we really cannot say much more. Challenging in a different way is the 16th century, because the three great playwrights of the age were all from modest backgrounds. Christopher Marlowe, the son of a poor shoemaker who benefited from a local grammar school with a specific founding brief to take in promising boys from a poor background. Ben Jonson, apprenticed as a bricklayer, served as a common soldier. And Shakespeare, the son of a small trader, a grammar school boy, the modesty of whose background has often been remarked and even used against him by the conspiracy theorists who say he didn't write his plays. I think what this tells us is that the rise of the theatre, and popular printing, and in fact the world of the Elizabethan Jacobean court gave some opening to ambitious writers of humble origin. Social mobility had increased. In this period there are some lesser known labouring class and artisanal poets too, such as the Protestant martyr John Clare, Thomas Deloney, the balladeer, Isabella Whitley, the first English woman to publish original secular verse, and William Muggins, who flourished in the 1590s and 1610s. Let's look at him. He was a London silk weaver whose wife had just given birth when the plague hit their household in August 1603. By the 29th, his apprentice Mary Black had died. His apprentice Robert Redmond died soon after, but Muggins' daughter Elizabeth died a week after that, and a third apprentice, Henry Best, died 2 days later. Muggins' response was far-sighted and courageous. Quarantined and unable to leave the house, in the autumn of 1603 he sat down and wrote an extended original poem on the plague, publishing it as a pamphlet. It's a long title, I apologise. London's mourning garment, or funeral tears worn and shed for the death of her wealthy citizens and honour her inhabitants, to which is added a zealous and fervent prayer with a true relation how many have died of all diseases in every particular parish within London, the Liberties and our parishes, from the 14th of July 1603 to the 17th of November following. This was not just a personal or a pious literary response, written in grief for his daughter and 3 other young people in his household. By including a set of London mortality statistics carefully compiled by parish, it becomes a historical record. Reflecting a recognition that his family is caught up in a larger historical horror, and that he must use his literary skill to document it in the future for posterity. A different sort of impulse governed the career of John Taylor, 1578 to 1653, the Thames water boatman and poet. He's significant partly because Robert Southey made him the first main figure in his account of the lives of what he called the uneducated poets. There has been scholarship recently that finds a lot of value in his writing, and even a recent symposium at Cambridge. The Thames watermen were the taxi drivers of their age, and because many of the playhouses and resorts tended to be on the south bank, out of reach of the city fathers, they plied a busy trade, also east to west, as an alternative to bad, congested roads. Taylor knew and admired Ben Jonson, and will likely have known Shakespeare, if only as a fair. I always wonder whether Taylor might have been the model for the garrulous waterman in the film Shakespeare in Love, who tells the bard he's a bit of a writer myself and is sharply told by Will to attend to his orders. So if Muggins had a sense of the historical moment as needing to be soberly recorded, Taylor had a nose for what would be well received by a popular readership at the price the rise of print culture had created, what the moment demanded in terms of passing fads and fashion. He specialised in gimmickry and novelty and self-pulsating stunts, catch penny titles and topics, and popular entertainment as much as a poet. And there's a lot more to be said about the 17th century, where the debates of the Civil War and the Commonwealth period, perhaps for the first time, or almost for the first time, often included the writings of labouring class or artisanal individuals, but I found scant evidence of named labouring class poets, at least until we come to the popular poet Ned Ward, 1667-1732, who, like John Taylor, belongs in a long line of figures working in popular forms, the writer as entertainer. So I apologise if I skip on to the 18th century, because he does merit attention. attention. So, Mike talked about the book of essays that I've edited recently with Alan Bridger, British Working Class and Radical Writings in 1700. And if you look at it, you might wonder why it begins with a detective story, a search for clues about how a poet's death occurred. That poem was Stephen Duck, who's already been mentioned twice, and he's important for two particular reasons. He was the first labouring class poet to achieve widespread public success and fame. I'll come back to that. The other reason is that he wrote a poem on his own situation. And this was the Thresher's Labour, 1730. And it does something unique in describing the hardship of field work and the winter work of threshing in the dusty barn. So if conventional pastoral Georgic poetry might portray the rural year as a journey to the triumph of harvest, Duck portrays it in Sisyphean terms, and he does use an image of Sisyphus pushing the stone eternally up the hill, as an eternal torment, a wheel of fire, an endless repetition of chores. A key moment is the harvest feast, when the farmer, who's portrayed throughout the poem as a grasping, hectoring figure who scrapes up excess grains of corn with his bare hands sooner than leave them for the gleaners, suddenly becomes too generous. Why? Well, it's to lull the workers. Duck calls this the cheat. A table plentifully spread we find of jugs of humming beer to cheer the mind, which he, too generous, pushes on so fast we think no toils to come, nor mind the past. But the next morning soon reveals the cheat, where the same toils again we must repeat, to the same barns again we must back return, to labour there for room for next year's corn. Now no one, and certainly no labourer, had ever written like this about rural labour, and especially not in the polite neoclassical couplet form Duck adopted, though he was also a lover of ballads. Duck was a modest man, and yet he sparked a revolution. Other worker poets emerged, including Mary Collier, whose poem The Woman's Labour, 1739, explicitly replies to Duck, who had slandered women working in the harvest field as lazy and over-talkative. Collier sharply and wittily refutes this, describing the double and triple burden of working class women's lives: labour, housekeeping, childminding. And while Duck as a day labourer has stable employment, these women must take on any work they can, harvesting or gleaning with their children, which was back-breaking, hand-cutting work. When harvest comes, into the field we go, and help to reap the wheat as well as you, or else we go with ears of corn to glean, no labour scorning, be it e'er so mean, but in the work we freely bear a part, and what we can, perform with all our heart. So if Duck's survival strategy is competitive and grumpily masculine, her women survive by taking pride in managing any and all work, however mean. And in winter this means going out charring, cleaning and hand-washing clothes for middle-class households. I'll just talk about one more poem inspired by Duck, and this is Robert Tattersall's The Bricklayer's Labours, 1734. Interesting because where else might we learn of what life was like for an 18th century builder? As with Collier and Duck, there's unique information encoded in these poems, which is one of the ways in which I think they're relevant. Tattersall describes getting ready for work at 6 o'clock in the morning. Then hanging on my threadbare coat and hose, my hat, my cap, my breeches and my shoes, with sheepskin apron girt about my waist, downstairs I go to visit my repast, which rarely doth consist of more than these: a quartern loaf and half a pound of cheese. Then in a linen bag on breakfast made, my day's allowance on my shoulders laid. And first, to keep the fog from coming in, I wet my whistle with a dram of gin. So thus equipped, my trowel in my hand, I haste to work and join the ragged band. I find these details of food and clothing fascinating, and the morning slug of gin before he rushes off to work, trowel in hand. I wrote a piece recently about Black Sabbath as a working class band of factory escapees, and I had reason to quote another building worker, the bricklayer Reg Presley, singer of the Trogs in the 1960s, who the moment he heard on the radio that their song Wild Thing had climbed the pop charts, turned to his workmates and said, "Share out me tools, I'm off." I feel sure Tattersall would have said much the same thing as his book started selling well for the building site he described as a rough, tough place of hard toil. Yeah, you need a good slug of gin before you even set off. Many more would follow in the footsteps of Duck and Collier. If Collier was only really known locally, her poems were nevertheless reprinted in the Romantic period and rediscovered by second-wave feminism. So The Woman's Labour was reprinted twice in 1974 by Sheila Rowbottom in Hidden from History and Mary Chamberlain in Fenman in her Collier-like reply to Ronald Blythe's Aching for You. Duck had never really disappeared, and that brings me to the other reason he remained significant, and that is his huge success and the ideological problems this raised for labouring class poets. For fairy tale like, Duck was summoned to court by Queen Caroline, who became his patron. Her husband, George II, famously complained, "Why will not my subjects write in prose?" But she liked poetry. Prime Minister Walpole had a dozen tame poets. Why shouldn't she have one? But then she didn't know quite what to do with Stephen Duck. And there was a period of uncertainty before he found a vocation, trained as a parish priest, and was admired for his sermons. Why is his death significant? Because the influencers of the age, as we would call them, were unhappy with his elevation. Wedded to a pre-Duckian view, if we can call it that, of rural labour as healthy, happy, unproblematic as a way of life, they saw his removal to court and to a clerical career as unnatural. And this ideology of rural labour as idle made class prejudice, and I dare say a fair amount of jealousy, respectable. So when in 1756 Stephen Duck died by drowning at Reading while journeying home from Bath, and this was soon reported to be a suicide, the floodgates opened. You see, this is what happens when you take a worker out of his natural life. You make him unhealthy, and you turn his mind, you unbalance his mind. Two later examples of these frequently aired attitudes. One is Horace Walpole, Pierre's son, who declared to Hannah More in 1784 that as a result of the Queen's patronage of Stephen Duck, 20 artisans and labourers turned poets and starved. And then Samuel Johnson, who said of the shoemaker and poet James Woodhouse, "He may make an excellent shoemaker, but he can never make a good poet. Your class is your destiny and your proper way of living." So in his chapter in our book, William Christensen weighs the evidence and finds it actually unlikely that Duck's death was anything more than the accidental drowning at a notoriously dangerous waterway of a man who already had one stroke, he'd been consulting doctors in Bath, and very likely now had a fatal one. Far from being a shoo-in for suicide, he was a contented man, and Christmas both reveals and undercuts the ideological backlash against labouring class poets. So hostile or sneering early responses to the phenomenon of labourers or artisans becoming poets would never quite fade away. though by 1783 George Crabbe could write in his poem The Village about Honest Duck, the poet who told the truth about common life, which would become Crabbe's own great theme. But labouring class poets were clearly under close scrutiny, and we can see this in two poets who were servants in middle class households where scrutiny is always intense. Mary Leaper, best known for her mock country house poem Crumble Hall, and Elizabeth Hans. Domestic service brought some privileges, but also created psychic anxiety and claustrophobia, the sense of constantly being under critical surveillance, not only from employers, but also from one's fellow workers, jealous of small advantages. In her poem The Visit, Mary Leaper wishes to slip away with her friend Artemisia to where careless creatures such as I may escape the penetrating eye of students in physiognomy. She means the male gaze, and the word careless does nice double service. She wants to be free of care, and also laughs about not taking care about the physical appearance on which they're routinely judged. Leaper's poem The Epistle of Deborah Doe rehearses anxiety about another kind of scrutiny, purporting to be a semi-literate letter written by a fellow servant, a comically named cook. In the letter, Mary, i.e. herself, is compared unfavourably to the cook's daughter, who is not only taller by a foot than she, Leaper was self-conscious about being short, but can knit a stocking in a day, make a pudding plump and rare, and boil her bacon to a hair. Poor, short Mary. On the other hand, they say, so it was they, isn't it, sits scribble all the day. Elizabeth Hans imagines hostile gossip against herself, not just for writing, but specifically as a published worker poet in this closed environment. But hers comes from upstairs, from the ladies and gentlemen in the parlour or around the dining table. Paired poems reflect the anxiety of a servant who composes. On the supposition of an advertisement appearing in the morning paper of the publication of a volume of poems by a servant name, the second poem on the supposition of a book having been published and read. Since these poems appeared in a volume, Death of Amnon, 1789, that had indeed been published and was now being read, the conversation, but not the situation, is fiction. And this is how she imagines the bars. A servant write verses, says Madame de Bloom. Pray, what is the subject? A mop or a broom? Says Miss Flounce. I suppose we shall see an ode to a dishcloth. What else can it be? So much for that. So, in another essay in our book, Tim Fulford shows how in the Romantic period, labouring class poets became a marketable phenomenon, spearheaded by Robert Bloomfield, whose poem The Farmer's Boy, 1800, was a bestseller. Although even more than Duck, he smuggled a great deal of grim rural realism in it, which the readers didn't seem to notice. Ian Hayward has written about this very powerfully in his essay The Infection of Bloomfield, which you can find online. This professionalisation or exploiting of labouring class poetry is especially associated with Robert Southey, who published and championed a number of poets, some posthumously, some living, and wrote the first real account of them as such, beginning as the introduction to one such poet and evolving into an independent work, The Lives of the Uneducated Poets, 1831. He sees this as a phenomenon that, for reasons to do with developments in society and class, became visible in the early 17th century, especially in the person of John Taylor, the boatman we've talked about. And he ends his catalogue with two late 18th century Bristol poets, Anne Yearsley, who's now much studied, and John Frederick Bryan. And he specifically excludes Bloomfield because his poems are worthy of preservation separately and in general collection. John Clare isn't mentioned. What it means, I think, is that Bloomfield is, as it were, a proper poet, not in the special category of the uneducated poet, because for Southey, one type of poet is worthy of attention in a charitable spirit, the other for its literary merit. And what he calls the uneducated poet is a specific phenomenon he sees as now fading from the world as education becomes widespread. It's a time-limited as well as a class-limited concept, and his term uneducated makes it so. It's an odd argument because if we turn that round into Brian Maidment's term, self-taught poets, in the subtitle of Poorhouse Fugitives, then we can see that what emerges, especially in the 19th century, peaking in the Chartist and post-Chartist years, is a huge number of poets who were self-made and self-taught, whatever their form of education, and successfully expressed themselves and published poetry, often of a very high order. Now, I've only got time to touch on one or two of them, but the sheer richness of labouring class poetry in the 19th century and its confidence, relative, is overwhelming. The biggest problem we had in the Pickering and Chatto 19th century volumes Mike referred to 20 years ago was which good poets to exclude. So, I'll look at a couple of them. I mentioned Joseph Skipsey, who emerged from dreadful poverty. A father shot dead by a policeman during a strike, a family reduced to eating nettle. To become one of the most ambitious and assured of all these poets. He had a special talent for ballads and word poems in plainly written short verses in quatrains, recording the sense of daily hardship, as in the much anthologized piece, Get Up. I'm not going to try and do this northeast because I can't, but get up, the caller calls, get up, and in the dead of night, to win the bairns their bite and sup, I rise a weary while. My flannel done, thrice along the birds are kissed, and then I with a whistle shut the door, I may not open again. Well, not a word wasted in this first-person account of preparing a pitwork. Labour's aggressive daily intrusion into family life is there in the blunt cry of the caller, get up, murdering sleep in the unnatural dead of night, and leaving the worker a ghost-like weary while. The caller was a colliery official that knocked men up for abortion. And the message in the third line is as uncompromising as the seller's cry, the caller's cry. He must win the bairns their bite and sup. He must work, or his children won't eat or drink. And the children are the key in this short poem. They are bairns who must be fed, and in the second verse he uses the endearment birds. Having donned his flannel done, his working clothes, the miner kisses the children thrice. Then he must shut the door on them with a finality emphasised in the closing line, I may not ope again. The whistle he makes as he shuts the door could be a nervous one, whistling in the dark. But I think that the reason for the dramatic finality is that he knows he may never see or kiss them again. Pit disasters, pitfalls, explosions, routine accidents claimed many miners' lives in the period. And Skipsey himself wrote a fine poem on the Hartley Colliery disaster of 1862, which also drew poems from the labour of class poets Janet Hamilton, Joan Wilson, Matthew Tate, Liverpool-born popular Newcastle songwriter Ned Corvan, and the Cornishman John Harris. The fact is, no one setting out for a ship that the miner could afford to feel safe. A.L. Lloyd's classic collection of mining songs, Come All Ye Bold Miners, has 33 about mining disasters and the deaths of miners. So I think Skipsey's 3 kisses, then the whistle, before the doors close with finality, form a superstitious ritual something common among men going on ship. 3 last kisses maybe, or a triple kiss, as a superstitious insurance policy against never seeing his children again, just in case. I think it's a brilliant poem, a model of concision. There are others just as good, like the poem Mother Wept, about a boy getting his orders for the first day down the mine, and his parents' deeply mixed feelings. Let me choose one more 19th century poet, a local figure here. Fanny Forrester, 1852 to 89, was a regular contributor to Ben Brierly's Journal, which was widely distributed in Manchester and beyond in the 1870s and 1880s. The daughter of Ellen Forrester, a poet and Fenian activist who served time in prison for her political activities, Fanny Forrester's own response to the crisis engulfing 19th century Ireland emerges in poems of exile and alienation, such as the 3-part sequence Strangers in the City, which documents the arrival, homelessness, severe working and living conditions and premature death of Mary, a timid fawn exiled from her native land along with her mother following a brutal land eviction which has split the family. It's serious material, but it's cast in terms of sentimental melodrama which may not necessarily evince a positive response in the modern reader. It may feel emotionally overladen, as in this description of Mary as her factory work from the second part, toiling in the city. Or her work from morn till evening bears her sweet and saintly face, but her busy hands oft tremble, and the tears each other chase. For she thinks of pleasant rambles to the quiet, lonely glen, and she wonders, will she ever hear a bird's sweet song again? Tears are frequent in this poem, alongside the contrast between Mary's sweet and saintly demeanour and the horribly unsaintly world she's cast into, between the factory full of noisy, dangerous, belt-driven machinery and the quiet glen she remembered, and again between the factory noise and the bird's sweet song of rural Ireland, cast as a lost Eden. Melodrama intensifies as Mary nears her death, and the deathbed scene itself is echoed in other Forrester poems, such as In the Workhouse, A Deserter's Story, where the old dying ex-soldier, like Mary in her garret, pathetically clings to a final vision of remembered beauty. Come nearer, nurse, come nearer, for my sight is growing dim. Just hold my hand and sing to me some simple vesper hymn, and I'll watch your kind eyes glistening, and my spirit shall rejoice, for I'll fancy I am listening to my Margaretta's voice. It's difficult to respond to such writing because we're conditioned by an aesthetic weighted against displays of emotion or sentiment, with the melodramatic Victorian death scene a special aesthetic taboo. I would say that Gregory has several scenes in his poems. But Forrester's poetry was greatly enjoyed by her contemporary readers. Ben Brierly, the editor who most championed and published it, and was himself a significant labouring class poet, later of Manchester Council, is similarly enthusiastic, writing with paternalistic pride of her as his most successful poetry contributor. So I think we need to throw off latter-day cultural prejudices to understand what she's doing and why, and perhaps recent work in the field of emotion and effect studies may help. I notice with particular interest that Simon Rennie's recent book on Cotton Family Poetry is subtitled Functions of Emotion in British and American Verse, 1861 to 65. I think this may represent a more nuanced and balanced approach to poetry of this kind. Well, there are some extraordinary figures in the 20th century too. I was thinking of the poet and chronicler Alfred Williams, relentlessly self-educating himself, rising at dawn to study before his morning shift in the Swindon Railway Factory, where every day he chalked on his stamping machine a different ancient Greek word to learn, and every day the foreman scrubbed it out again, until one day Williams quit his job and went on to write one of the great accounts of industrial labour, Life in a Railway Factory, 1915. Oh yeah, he left a single final word chalked on his machine. Vinci, Latin, I will. Or Ethel Coney Holdsworth, the Lancashire textile factory worker, feminist and socialist, who wrote poetry and journalism and popular intelligent novels of working class life that kept her close to, rather than writing away from, her fellow women workers. Alfred Williams tended to be quite an isolated figure. Kathleen Bell has written eloquently about this achievement in her chapter in our book, Ethel Coney Holdsworth and the Question of Audience. She talks about how working class writers and readers interact. And much more needs to be said about all these poets and others, but I want to end now with a poet who died only last year after a long and productive and profoundly effective career as a poet, an occupation he was particularly proud to have written in his passport. This was Tony Harrison, 1937 to 2005, a poetry beloved of John Halstead, after whom the present lecture is named, and for good reason. I'm not suggesting in any sense that labouring class poetry ends with Harrison, far from it. There are very many active labouring class and autodidact poets in Britain and all over the world, and may there long continue to be so, at least as long as society remains as stratified as it does. I think Harrison's poetry, and I'm quoting myself here, has done as much as any single body of writing in English to articulate the conflicts and complexities facing the working class writer in the modern world. He dealt head-on with the key binaries, the threats to family and class loyalty, inevitable in his own emergence as a poet and a bearer of literacy. Articulated magnificently in the School of Eloquence sonnets on family and on class in V, the elegiac poem set in the Leeds graveyard where his parents are buried. The implications of such divided loyalties in terms of language and class he dealt with especially boldly by being both a learned classicist with a head full of Greek and Latin like Alfred Williams, and also like Williams, who was a noted collector of folk songs, a champion of our common language, particularly Northern, particularly Yorkshire speech forms. Not only did he adapt the text of the Mysteries, popular religious plays originating in the medieval craft guilds, into a northern linguistic register, but he took one of the greatest works of classical Greece, the Oresteia of Aeschylus, and put that into a native, alliterative, thoroughly northern English style too, using compounds and gaps between phrases to adopt the complexities of the text to his style. Just to give one example, the great anti-war speech of the chorus in the Agamemnon, in the standard Richmond Latin War translation, runs: "The god of war, money changer of dead bodies, held the balance of his spear in the fighting, and from the corpse fires of Ilium sent to their dearest the dust, heavy and bitter with tears shed, packing smooth the urns with ashes that once were there." Which is a good translation, not knocking that. Harrison's version: "Gelshark Ares, god of war, broker of men's bodies, usurer of living flesh, corpse trafficker, that god is. Give to war your men's flesh gold, and what are your returns? Kilos of cold clinker, packed in army issue urns." Absolutely in-your-face, alternative way of translating the classic. He noticed early on the class implications of how comedy was low and tragedy was high, and remembers in the poem on not being Milton, "I played the drunken porter in Macbeth." So he broke down this binary restoring, for example, one of the comic satyr plays that were always performed after the tragic trilogies in ancient Greece that had been obliterated, and made from it perhaps his finest play, The Trackers of Oxyrhynchus, which, among other things, is an extended meditation on what gets saved and what gets left in the rubbish heap, and so on value and on class. His lyrical works, from A Compact for John Keats through to Fig on the Time, insist on the beauty and pleasure of human appetite, desire and joy for life, our common experiences so often effaced or censured in official culture. He had a humanistic love of life, but also accepted its strict limitations. Life has a skin of death that keeps its zest, as he put it in his dialogue with Keats across the century. Harrison wrote in rhymed and rhythmic forms, but as he said, the meter itself is like the pulse. I don't have the heart to confront some experiences unless I know I have this rhythm to carry me to the other side. It's an existential need, a metrical form for me. So let me conclude now with an example from his rhymed verses. It's one that I think nicely illustrates an acceptance of unglamorous common life, the ordinariness of love and loyalty, the truth that Duck and Collier were trying to express, but a more personal poem that understands how life is finite, how we grow old and infirm, and need to acknowledge and share our human vulnerabilities. This is from The Beast with Two Backs, very ironic quote from Othello, in his late collection Laureate's Blood, 2000, and I'll end with it. Their sulks and marital misunderstanding were often healed by hot lumbago balm. I'd seen one or the other cross the landing to wash the pungent fire off the palm. What may have kept them coupled through such days was thinking that the worst of being alone, though you can gratify yourself in other ways, you can't rub your own back with Dr. Sloan's. In the rheumatic north in icy weather, dapper Dr. Sloan with waxed mustachios could keep my parents silently together, touching the parts they'd soon